You order something online from a seller on the other side of the planet. You barely think about it. A few days later, it's sitting on your doorstep, wrapped in cardboard, like the ocean between you and them was never really there. Now imagine a government making that connection not just difficult, but a capital crime. For nearly 200 years, that was reality for millions of people living on China's coast. But the real story behind that ban is far stranger than simple isolation. It's called hygiene, the sea ban, and it didn't start as an attack on trade itself. It started as a response to fear. Picture the southern coast of China in the early Ming dynasty, sometime in the 1370s. Villages built along inlets and river mouths. Fishing boats pulled up on the sand. Merchants who had spent generations moving silk, porcelain, and spices along a coastline stretching thousands of miles. Then picture something else moving along that same coastline. Pirate fleets, known as woku, striking fishing villages and trading posts, then vanishing back into open water before any response could reach them. The Ming court's answer was blunt. If pirates were using the sea to attack, then ordinary people would simply be forbidden from using the sea at all. Private maritime trade was banned. Ships beyond a certain size were outlawed. Coastal communities that had survived on fishing and trade for generations were told, essentially, to turn their backs on the water. Did it work? Not the way anyone intended. Historian Timothy Brook, who has studied Ming China extensively, has described how policies meant to eliminate coastal disorder often produced the opposite effect. Banning legal trade didn't make the demand for foreign goods disappear. It just moved that demand underground. Smuggling networks expanded along the very coastline the ban was supposed to seal off. Local officials tasked with enforcing a law that starved their own regions of income often looked the other way for a price. Bribery became so embedded in coastal administration that some ports functioned as semi-legal trade hubs in everything but name. The Wokou pirates the policy was designed to stop didn't vanish either. In many cases, they simply merged with the smuggling networks the ban had created, blurring the line between pirate and merchant almost completely. Historian Robert Antony, who has extensively researched piracy along China's southern coast, has documented how this blurred identity persisted for centuries. Fishermen became smugglers when the fish weren't running. Smugglers became pirates when smuggling got difficult. The sea ban, meant to draw a clean line between lawful and criminal, instead produced an entire economy that lived in the space between the two. So the Ming version of hygiene was inconsistent, loosely enforced, occasionally lifted, occasionally reinstated, shaped as much by court politics as by any coherent maritime strategy. Then the Qing dynasty took the same idea and applied it with far more force. After conquering Ming China in the mid-1600s, the Qing faced their own coastal threat. Resistance movements loyal to the fallen Ming, some operating from ships just off the coast, using the sea the same way the Wokou once had, as a place beyond the reach of land-based armies. The Qing response went further than any previous ban. Rather than simply restricting ships, the government ordered entire coastal populations to relocate inland. People living along the coasts of Guangdong, Fujian, Zhejiang, Jiangnan, and Shandong were forced to abandon homes their families may have occupied for generations and move miles inland, sometimes with only days of notice. Try picturing that scale for a moment. Not a handful of villages, multiple provinces, an entire strip of populated coastline, deliberately emptied. The land that would one day become two of the most densely populated, economically vital cities on Earth, Hong Kong and Shenzhen, spent this period as essentially uninhabited wasteland. Fishing villages abandoned, farmland left fallow. A coastline that had supported human life for centuries, sitting empty. Because a government decided the sea itself was the problem. People were not permitted to return and resettle their ancestral homes until the last of these bans was lifted in 1683. Think about what that actually means for a family. Grandparents born on a coastline none of their grandchildren would ever see, because by the time resettlement was finally allowed, the world those grandparents remembered was already a different generation's ancient history. Even after 1683, when private trade was cautiously permitted again, the Qing kept an extremely tight grip on exactly how foreigners were allowed to interact with China at all. Trade with Western nations was funneled through Macau and later concentrated almost entirely at Guangzhou, under what became known as the Canton system. Foreign merchants weren't permitted to travel freely through the country, learn the language beyond what commerce required, or deal directly with anyone outside a small, government-licensed group of Chinese merchants called the Kohong. From the outside, this looked like caution. From the perspective of foreign traders, particularly the British, it looked like a locked door with one narrow keyhole, and that narrow keyhole eventually became the center of one of the most consequential conflicts in modern Chinese history. By the early 1800s, Britain wanted access to Chinese markets that the Canton system simply didn't allow. Tea, porcelain, and silk were flowing out of China in enormous volume, but Qing restrictions meant almost nothing British merchants wanted to sell was flowing back in, aside from silver. To correct that imbalance, British traders began smuggling opium into China on a massive scale, despite it being illegal under Qing law. Historian Julia Lovell, in her account of this period, has described how the resulting Opium War wasn't really a war about a drug. It was, in a much deeper sense, a war about who controlled access to Chinese ports and whether a closed trading system built on centuries of sea bans could survive contact with an empire determined to break it open by force. China lost. The 1842 Treaty of Nanjing, signed after that defeat, didn't just end the war. It ended the entire logic behind hygiene. Additional ports were forced open. Hong Kong was ceded to Britain outright, the very land that had once sat empty by imperial decree, now permanently altered by the war that finally broke the ban meant to protect it.